Close your eyes for a moment. Picture the Middle Ages. What do you see? Maybe a mighty castle on a misty hill, knights in shining armor, a noble lady weaving on a balcony, maybe a bard singing tales by the fire, and peasants dancing merrily at a village fair. But what if I told you that image is a lie? The truth, the real, brutal truth, is much darker. If you had been born in Europe 800 years ago, there's a 95% chance you wouldn't be a knight, or a noble, or even someone with clean clothes. You'd be a peasant, a serf, or a beggar, someone whose life wasn't defined by romantic tales, but by hunger, disease, back-breaking labor, and constant fear, and worse. Your story would never be told. Until now. Let's peel away the fantasy, the movies, the festivals, the fairy tales. Let's step into the mud-soaked boots of the forgotten millions who lived, suffered, and died in the shadows of castles, invisible in history books, written by kings. This is the true story of what life was really like for the poor in the Middle Ages. Before we begin, can I ask you something quiet? What time is it where you are right now? And where in the world are you listening from? If you feel like it, share it in the comments. I'd love to know. Just imagine people from all over the world drifting off together. And if this story feels comforting, or it keeps you company tonight, maybe tap the like button and subscribe if you haven't yet. It helps more than you know, and it tells me to keep whispering stories like this just for you. You see, history is often written by the powerful and romanticized by those who never had to live it. We've built a whole industry around this image. Renaissance fairs, medieval video games, royal dramas on Netflix. But behind the lords and ladies, there were people just like us, living in conditions most of us today would find unimaginable. Imagine being born in a hut made of straw and dung, no windows, no warmth, just a dirt floor, some fleas, and maybe, if you're lucky, a wool blanket shared with 3 siblings and a goat. You don't own the land, you don't own your tools, you don't even own your time. From the moment you're born, you belong to someone else. That's called feudalism, a system where the king owns everything. The nobles control the land, and you, well, you work until you die. That's your role, not because you're lazy or uneducated, but because the system is rigged to keep you there. And it starts with silence. Most peasants couldn't read or write, not because they were stupid, but because education was never offered to them. In fact, it was discouraged. The fewer people who could read, the fewer who could question. The church had the Bible, the Lord had the laws, and the poor, they had obedience. Let's talk about that silence, because it wasn't just illiteracy, it was invisibility. When you read history books, you hear about kings who waged wars, but who talks about the peasants who were forced to fight in them? You hear about knights going on crusades, but who writes about the children left behind to starve while their fathers marched off for God and glory? Even now, we celebrate medieval art, but most of it was religious or royal. Very little shows the everyday life of the common poor, because no one thought they were worth painting, and so their suffering vanished from the canvas of history. But let's bring them back. Let's walk through a village in the 1200s. It's early morning, you wake up shivering, there's frost on the ground and no firewood left. Your hut smells of smoke, rot, and animals. Your mother is already outside, pulling water from a well. Your father is coughing again. He caught something last winter and never really recovered. Breakfast, a crust of bread if you're lucky, no butter, no milk, maybe some turnips. Your stomach still aches from the night before, but there's no time to complain. Today, like every day, you have work to do. You head out to the fields owned by your Lord. Not your fields, his. You owe him labor, rent, and half your crop. You work with your bare hands, no gloves, no real tools. The soil is hard. Your back hurts. You're 14 years old, but you already feel like 40. The sun is hot, or maybe it's raining. Either way, there's no escape. This isn't just a bad day. This is your life. Still think of the Middle Ages as romantic. It's easy to glorify the past when we only look at the castles. But history isn't built on palaces. It's built on pain, and the ones who've suffered the most, the poor, are the ones we forget first. But here's the thing. They were real, just like you. They had dreams. They laughed. They cried. They told stories. They sang songs. They watched their children grow or buried them far too young. They lived under systems they couldn't change. But sometimes they resisted, quietly, desperately. With strength we can only begin to understand in this series. We're not going to tell you the version of history you saw in textbooks. We're going to walk in the footsteps of the forgotten. We'll explore their lives from cradle to grave. The hunger, the dirt, the prayers, the punishments, the revolts, the tiny joys they clung to in a world that gave them nothing. Because the question isn't just how brutal was it, it's how did they survive. So stay with me, because this journey, though painful, reveals something profound. It shows us not just how far we've come, but how many people, even today, still live in systems that feel shockingly similar. Imagine it's midnight in a medieval village. The only light comes from a flickering fire, half buried in ash. A woman screams, not in terror, but in pain. She's giving birth on a pile of straw in a damp, smoky hut. There's no doctor, no sterilized tools, just two village women wiping sweat from her brow, praying the baby comes quickly, and breathing, because in this world, not even your first breath is guaranteed. In the Middle Ages, being born poor wasn't just unfortunate, it was dangerous from the very beginning. Childbirth was one of the most common causes of death for women, and for the baby. It was a lottery, a brutal one. No hospital, no anesthesia, no clean hands. The midwife, if there even was one, probably learned her craft from her mother or her grandmother. There were no formal classes, no diplomas, just experience, folk remedies, and faith. And when something went wrong, they turned to prayers, herbs, or superstition. And things often went wrong, even before the baby was born. Survival was uncertain. Most poor women were malnourished throughout pregnancy. That meant underdeveloped babies, weak lungs, and mothers too tired to push. If the baby was breached coming out feet first, it often meant death for both child and mother. There were no cesareans, no fetal monitors, no options, and once the baby arrived, the struggle had only just begun. Let's say a baby boy is born in a peasant hut in 1310. He's breathing. That's a miracle in itself. But the next few days are critical. There's no incubator, no formula. The mother's milk might be thin or dry. If she dies, and many did, there's no replacement. Cow's milk might help, but only if you owned a cow. Most didn't. Wet nurses were expensive. So what did the poor do? Sometimes, nothing. Babies simply died. Quietly, often. Burials were quick. Grief was short. Not because parents didn't care, but because they couldn't afford to stop. Imagine this: in some villages, half of all children died before age 5. That wasn't rare, that was expected. Parents would often have 8 to 10 children, hoping a few might survive to adulthood. Think about that. You give birth again and again, not out of joy, but out of fear, because death is always nearby. What did poor infants eat? If breast milk wasn't enough, they were fed pap, a paste made from bread and water, sometimes mashed peas or grain. No vitamins, no hygiene, no refrigeration. Food would sit out for hours. Spoiled milk, rancid meat, even contaminated water. Diarrhea was a death sentence for an infant. No one knew about germs. Clean water was rare. People drank ale or wine instead. Even toddlers and diapers, they didn't exist. Babies were wrapped in cloths or strips of linen, rarely changed. Rashes turned to infections. Infections led to fevers. Fevers led to silence. Imagine being a mother and watching your baby's skin turn hot, his eyes dull. You don't know what's happening. There's no doctor to call, no medicine to give. You pray, you cry, you watch, then you bury. But here's the hardest part. Even when babies survived, their lives weren't filled with laughter and toys. Childhood as we know it today didn't really exist for the poor. The moment you could walk, you were put to work, carrying water, picking herbs, chasing chickens. By age 5, you might be helping in the fields. By 7, you'd be expected to do serious chores. By 12, you were nearly an adult. And by 14, many were married. At 14, sometimes younger. For girls, that meant childbirth before their bodies were ready. For boys, it meant a lifetime of labor. Or the sword, if war came calling. Illness was everywhere. Even minor infections killed children. Earaches turned to brain infections. Cuts became deadly wounds. There were no antibiotics, no vaccines. Smallpox, measles, scarlet fever, all roamed freely. And medicine, well, it depended on who you asked. If you were lucky, someone might try herbs. If you were unlucky, they'd blame a demon, bleed you, burn you, or just leave you to die, believing it was God's will. And if you cried too much, some believed it meant the child was cursed. Evil spirits, a changeling. Some children were even abandoned or smothered, not out of cruelty, but out of fear and superstition. This was a world where the line between life and death was razor thin, and belief filled the space where science should have been. But amidst all this horror, the cold, the hunger, the risk, love still existed. Parents loved their children. Mothers sang lullabies. Fathers cradled newborns beside the fire. They didn't have much, but they held on fiercely to what little joy they could find. A healthy child was a miracle. A laughing toddler, a gift. Even the poorest peasants celebrated births with simple feasts, warm bread, and homemade wine. They had no money, but they had rituals, customs, names with meaning. Hope that maybe this one would survive, that maybe this one would grow strong. So the next time we think of medieval life as romantic, imagine a child wrapped in old cloth, lying beside a smoky fire, coughing in the night. A mother listening for every breath. A father praying silently in the dark. That was reality for the poor in the Middle Ages, and it was only the beginning, because if you were born poor, your real battle didn't start at birth. It started the very next day. By the time he's 7 years old, the boy has already stopped asking why. Why are we always tired? Why can't we eat more? Why does Father bow when the Lord rides by? Why does the priest say we were born to suffer? The questions dry up because the answers don't matter. This is life. Not just his, but everyone's around him. From the moment he was born, his fate was sealed. He is a serf. But what does that mean? Let's break it down. Serfs were not exactly slaves, but they were not free either. They were legally bound to the land they were born on. That means they couldn't move, couldn't quit, couldn't leave, want to visit your cousin in the next village. You'd need permission from the Lord. Want to marry someone from another estate. Permission. Want to stop working. Impossible. You weren't just tied to your job. You were the job, and the system that made it that way. Feudalism was designed to keep you stuck forever. Feudalism sounds like a complicated political idea, but to a peasant, it was simple. There's a king. He owns everything. He gives land to powerful nobles, lords, barons, bishops. In return, they give him soldiers and loyalty. The lords give smaller pieces of land to knights and vassals, and at the very bottom of this pyramid is you. You, the peasant, the serf, the one who actually works the land. You grow the food, you dig the ditches, you raise the animals, but you own none of it. In theory, you get protection. In reality, you get taxes. In theory, you get justice. In reality, you get punished. And there's no promotion, no working your way up, because you were born into this, and you will die in this, just like your father, and his before that. A prison with no bars, a life sentence you inherit at birth, and the worst part, you don't even know what's outside. There's no school, no books, no newspapers. Most peasants couldn't read, not even their own names. In fact, literacy was dangerous. To the powerful, an educated peasant was a threat, because if you could read, you could question. You might read the Bible and realize it never says you must starve to please the Lord. You might learn about another village where people rebelled. You might write a letter, speak to outsiders, dream bigger, and so the system made sure that didn't happen. Church sermons were read in Latin, a language you didn't understand. Laws were written by the lords. Justice was spoken in courts you couldn't enter. You were taught obedience, not curiosity, fear, not freedom. The village priest might be your only source of truth, and even he served the feudal system. But the control didn't stop at your mind. It reached into your stomach, your hands, your bones. You had to give up part of every harvest to your lord. This could be grain, eggs, chickens, or even time, working extra days on the lord's private land for free. These were called feudal dues, and they never ended. On top of that, you paid tithes to the church, 10% of your income, even if you had almost nothing. You also owed tolls to use the Lord's mill, his oven, his wine press. If you wanted to grind your own grain at home, illegal, punishable by fine, or worse, you were taxed for marrying, for dying, even for traveling. Everything cost something, and you had nothing to pay with but your labor. And if you couldn't pay, you begged, you stole, or you starved. Let's go back to our boy, now almost a man. He's 14. His hands are already calloused. His back aches like his father's. He knows how to plant barley, dig ditches, mend roofs, herd pigs, but he can't write his name. He's never seen a map. He doesn't even know what a country is. To him, the world ends where the forest begins. The outside is myth. Towns are stories. Books are magic. Freedom, a rumor, but sometimes Cracks appear in the system. A wandering friar passes through, whispering forbidden ideas. A soldier returns from war and tells of cities, trade, and silver coins. A traveling merchant shows a coin with the face of a king the boy's never seen, and, for a moment, the boy wonders, what else is out there? What if I left? But then he remembers he can't. Not without permission, not without money, not without risking his life. And so he buries the thought. He returns to the field, and the cycle continues. This is what the medieval world did best. Repetition. It taught each generation to accept their chains, not with violence, but with silence, with stories, with obedience, with fear. That's how power survives. So when we talk about poverty in the Middle Ages, we're not just talking about hunger. We're talking about a complete lack of possibility. No education, no mobility, no escape. Your dreams were cut down before they could bloom. Your curiosity was beaten out of you. Your hope, a luxury you couldn't afford. But sometimes, rarely, a fire would spark. A thought, a rebellion, a child who refused to stay silent, and those moments changed everything. The rooster doesn't wake you up. You were already awake. You've been tossing and turning since the cold crept in through the thatched roof some time before dawn. Your breath is visible in the air. You pull the wool blanket tighter around your body, trying not to wake the others. 4 of you, mother, father, your younger brother, and you share one bed. The baby sleeps in a wooden box filled with straw. The fire went out hours ago. This isn't a bad night. This is every night. The grind begins before the sun rises, because for a poor medieval peasant, sleep is not rest. It's just a pause before the next round of work. You throw on your tunic. It's stained, patched, itchy. You've worn it every day this season. No shoes in summer, maybe wooden clogs in winter. You step outside into the morning fog. Chickens cluck. The air smells of wet earth, smoke, and manure. Your first job, fetch water. The well is down the road, and the road is mud. The bucket is heavy before it's even full. By the time the sun breaks the horizon, your day has already started, and it won't end until darkness returns. Here's how it unfolds. Morning, field labor. You carry the bucket back. Hands frozen, arms aching. Your father is already outside, tying up oxen. The family's small plot lies beyond the village, edge past the ditch, over the ridge. The tools are crude, wooden plows, hand-forged hoes, nothing with wheels or pulleys. You spend the morning bent over, planting, weeding, digging, sweating. Even when it's cold, every movement hurts. Your back cramps. Your hands blister. There's no choice. You don't work. You don't eat. You might sing to pass the time, a simple song passed down for generations. You don't know who wrote it, but it keeps you moving. And that's the thing. Medieval peasants weren't lazy. They were relentless. Midday, the bare minimum lunch, isn't a break, it's a breath. You sit in the grass, dirty and tired, and chew on what little you've brought. Usually, it's coarse, black bread, hard, dry, often moldy, maybe a bit of porridge made from barley or oats. If it's a good day, there's onion or cheese, meat, rare, reserved for feast days, or when an animal dies naturally. Water is warm by now. You sip carefully. Too much, and it won't last. There's no concept of relaxation. You talk about the weather, the harvest, a cousin who got sick. You pray for rain, or pray for it to stop. Either way, nature controls everything. Afternoon, the Lord's fields, your own crops aren't enough. You also owe labor to the manor, Lord, usually 2 or 3 days a week. His fields are larger, flatter, easier to work, but none of it is yours. You till his land with the same hands that till your own. He keeps the harvest, you keep the blisters. Sometimes the steward, a man with a whip and a sneer, watches from a distance, making sure you don't slow down. You don't dare look him in the eye. You're not working for money. You're working for permission to exist. Evening, livestock repairs, survival, the sun dips low. You return home, but you're not done. The animals must be fed, the roof patched, firewood collected, tools mended, children watched. Your mother prepares dinner. It's a repeat of lunch, thinner, colder, sometimes flavored with herbs, if they're in season. If not, ash and salt. You eat in silence. The baby coughs. Your father massages his hands. You look at your mother and wonder how she still smiles. You're 13, but you feel 50. There's no time to think. Just enough time to hope tomorrow is dry. Night, the briefest pause, the fire is lit again. A small flame, fed with whatever wood you found. The room fills with smoke. Your eyes burn, but you're used to it. No one reads. No one tells stories tonight. There's no energy left that you lie down beside your brother, head on a sack of straw. The blanket itches. The wind whistles through the cracks. You hear the priest's bell in the distance. A final reminder, death comes for all. So pray fast, sleep fast, wake up stronger, because tomorrow you do it all again. This is the grind. Every single day, no holidays, no weekends, no medical leave. Only Sunday Mass gave you rest. And even then, you had to sit through a sermon telling you that your suffering was holy. Imagine that. You work all week. You give your food to your Lord. Your children die from bad water. And when you finally stop to breathe, you're told it's your fault or that it's part of God's plan. No wonder some peasants rebelled. But we'll get there soon. Now here's a bitter truth. A medieval peasant worked harder than most people today, but they lived shorter lives, ate worse food, and owned nothing, and yet they kept going, not because they were weak, but because they were strong, stronger than most of us will ever need to be. Their lives were brutal, but not meaningless. Their names were forgotten, but their labor built everything. We walk on their bones. We live in the comfort they never knew, and we owe them remembrance. It starts with silence, not the quiet of peace, but the silence of empty stomachs, of spoons scraping wooden bowls, of a family sitting around a hearth, pretending they're not starving. In the medieval world, hunger wasn't an occasional inconvenience. It was a shadow that never left, because when you are poor, the question isn't what's for dinner, it's will there be dinner at all. The life of a medieval peasant was completely dependent on the harvest. Too much rain, the grain rots in the field. Too little, the earth cracks, the crops die. A sudden frost in spring, a swarm of locusts, disease in the livestock. It could mean no food, not just for a day or a week, but for the entire winter. And if one village went hungry, others probably did too. There was no national food reserve, no aid trucks, no charity kitchens, just neighbors sharing what little they had or guarding it behind locked doors. Even in the best of times, medieval peasants lived on the edge of famine. In bad times, they toppled straight into it. Let's go back to our village. The harvest has failed. It's been raining for weeks. The barley has molded. The root vegetables never sprouted. The wheat collapsed into mud. You watched it happen. You hoped it might recover. But now the fields are empty, dead, and winter is coming. You have 3 sacks of grain stored. That's all. You can ration it, thin it with water, mix it with acorns, ground bark, even dirt. But you know it won't last. That's when hunger changes you. At first, it's just discomfort. You feel weak, dizzy. You drink water to fill the ache. Then your muscles cramp. You lose weight. You wake up at night, clutching your belly. The children cry more often. They sleep more. One stops speaking altogether. Your father looks thinner every day. Your mother's face, once full, is now sharp and pale. She pretends to eat, but you know she's giving you her share. Then come the desperate choices. You begin to eat whatever you can find. Boiled weeds, tree bark, moss, rotten apples, moldy cheese scraped clean. You trap rats, birds, frogs. You chew leather, not to digest, but to pretend. Some villagers begin eating clay, some mixed ground-up bones with flour to stretch it. Some wander into the woods and don't come back. And sometimes, yes, even darker rumors start to spread in some parts of Europe. During the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, it was whispered that people dug up graves, that mothers abandoned their babies in the woods, that strangers were invited in and never seen again. We don't know how many of these stories are true, but we do know this. People were desperate enough. Because starvation doesn't kill you quickly, it kills your strength first, then your dignity, then your mind, and worst of all, it kills your hope. During these famines, entire villages disappeared. The young died first, then the old, then the sick. The survivors emerged in spring looking like ghosts, skin stretched tight, teeth missing, eyes sunken. Some blamed the weather, some blamed God, some blamed witches, but no one blamed the system, because, for the poor, there was no one to blame, no safety net, no backup plan. The Lord still demanded taxes. The church still demanded tithes. Even if you had nothing, you were expected to give. Some peasants tried to hide their grain. If they were caught, they could be whipped, fined even, hanged, and what about begging? Maybe, if you were lucky, you could leave your village and find food elsewhere, but travel was dangerous. Beggars were often treated like thieves. Some were beaten or thrown into ditches. Others died on the road, in cities. Famine often meant disease. People crowded together, weakened, desperate. Food prices soared. Bread riots erupted. Bakers were lynched. Authorities cracked down with brutal force. And yet, somehow, some people survived. Because humans, even at their most broken, find ways to endure. Neighbors shared crumbs. Families pooled whatever they had. Herbalists dug for roots in hidden forests. Mothers told bedtime stories on empty stomachs to soothe their children's cries. A stolen egg became a feast. A pot of thin soup became a miracle, and when spring finally returned, when the snow melted and the first green shoots appeared, you'd see villagers cry just at the sight of a blooming flower. Because to the poor, nature was not beauty, it was survival. But what did surviving mean? It meant emerging from winter with fewer teeth, fewer children, fewer neighbors. It meant burying the weak and pretending you weren't next. It meant going right back to work, planting, hoping, praying, knowing that next year it could happen again. And it often did. Famine wasn't a one-time event, it was a repeating cycle. Always just a failed harvest away. So next time you hear someone say, medieval people were used to suffering, remember this: no one gets used to watching their children starve. No one gets used to eating bark. No one gets used to digging graves with trembling hands. Not for strangers, but for family. They didn't suffer because they were weak. They survived because they were strong. Hunger starves you slowly, but disease strikes like a ghost. Invisible, unexpected, and all too often, unstoppable. In the Middle Ages, you didn't need to be weak to die. You just needed to breathe near the wrong person. And if you were poor, as most people were, you had no defense, no medicine, no knowledge, no protection. All you had was fear and prayer. Let's begin with the most infamous killer of them all, the Black Death. It arrived in Europe in 1347, creeping in on merchant ships through the ports of Sicily. No one knew what it was. No one knew what it wanted. But it spread faster than fire. Some say it was fleas on rats. Others say it was airborne. What we know is that, in just 4 years, it killed between 25 and 50 million people in Europe alone. That's 1 out of every 3 people. Imagine that for a moment. Walk through your town, picture your street. Now erase every 3rd face. Gone in days. Sometimes in hours. The first sign was usually a headache, then chills, then black swellings in the neck, armpits, or groin buboes, swollen lymph nodes that turned dark, filled with pus, and burst. Fever followed, vomiting, bleeding from the nose and mouth, delirium, collapse, death. There were no doctors for the poor, no hospitals that would accept them. The wealthy fled the cities, the priests locked their doors. You were on your own. Let's go back to the peasant village. You've survived famine. You're thin but alive. You're planting turnips when you hear that someone in the next village coughed blood and died that same night. By the next morning, there are 10 more, and then it reaches your village. Your neighbor's son collapses in the field. Your aunt begins vomiting black bile. Your baby brother develops a fever that won't break. You hold him, you sing to him, you beg God, and then he stops breathing, and there's nothing you can do. The dead pile up faster than they can be buried. The local priest tries to perform last rites, but soon he too falls ill. Eventually, no one comes near the dying. Families abandon their own. Cart drivers come each day, shouting down the roads, "Bring out your dead." Bodies are dumped in mass graves. No coffins, no markers, just dirt over flesh. In some places, the smell is so strong, people lose consciousness, and, through it all, the church tells you to repent, that this is punishment for your sins, as if you had caused this. But the Black Death was not the first plague, and it wasn't the last. Disease was a permanent resident in medieval life. Leprosy, a slow, disfiguring disease, was feared and misunderstood. Those infected were banished from villages, forced to wear bells so others could hear them coming. They were called unclean, untouchable, cursed. Dysentery, caused by dirty water, swept through villages every summer. Diarrhea could kill a child in hours. And there were no toilets, no sewage systems, no clean wells. Your water might be downstream from someone else's waste. Tuberculosis, coughing blood, wasting away, dying slowly in bed. Smallpox, measles, typhoid, and fevers of all kinds. No one knew what caused them. Was it bad air, demons, witches, akauji? The rich blamed the poor. The church blamed sin. and the poor blamed themselves. There were doctors, yes, but not for you. Most peasants never saw a physician, and if they did, they likely couldn't afford the treatments, which often involved bloodletting, applying leeches, or drinking potions made from crushed beetles and urine. Barber surgeons might cut open buboes or amputate infected limbs with no anesthetic. Most cures made things worse, and when those failed, they turned to folk healers. Women who knew herbs, old men who whispered incantations. But be careful, healing too, well, could get you accused of witchcraft. The psychological toll was as heavy as the physical one. You lived in constant fear. A cough could mean death. A fever could mean isolation. A simple wound could become infected and turn deadly. Children didn't just play, they attended funerals. Mothers didn't just give birth, they prepared for burials. Imagine being 12 and already having buried 3 siblings. Imagine never hugging your grandmother again because she started coughing. Imagine your body trembling in the night, not from sickness, but from the fear of catching it. And yet, amidst all this horror, there was something incredible. The poor still lived. They didn't have medicine, but they had resilience. They didn't have hospitals, but they had each other. They nursed their sick with dirty rags and broken hands. They buried their with songs and prayers, and when the plagues passed, when the death carts stopped coming, they began again. They tilled the soil, they rebuilt homes, they gave birth, they loved again. But the wounds remained. The population of Europe shrank so dramatically that entire villages vanished. Labor became scarce. Landowners panicked. Some peasants began demanding better wages. Some even left the land, something that was once illegal. So, ironically, the Black Death, though horrific, cracked open the feudal system. It exposed how fragile the hierarchy was. It gave the poor a glimpse of power, and that terrified the elite. In today's world, we often say, no one is above the law, but in medieval Europe, if you were poor, you were never beneath it either. You were crushed by it, because the law wasn't about fairness, it wasn't about truth, it was about order and keeping you in your place. If you were a peasant, justice wasn't something you could count on. It was something you survived. Let's say you steal a loaf of bread. You're not a thief. You're starving. Your baby hasn't eaten in 2 days. The Lord's kitchen throws out scraps, but the dogs get more than the people. So one night, in desperation, you sneak into the bakehouse. You take one small, round loaf. You run. You think no one saw, but they did. The next morning, the steward drags you into the village square. You plead, you cry, you explain, but no one listens, because, in the eyes of the law, you're not a human with hunger. You're a criminal with dirty hands. Punishment comes swiftly. If you're lucky, it's the stocks. You're locked in a wooden frame, feet and hands pinned, while the village spits on you. Children throw rocks. Your neighbors watch, maybe in sympathy, maybe in fear. If you're unlucky, you lose a hand or an ear, or they brand your face with a hot iron, a permanent scar to warn others, all for a loaf of bread. Let's talk about the law itself. There were 2 kinds in most medieval communities: manorial law and royal law. Royal law, the king's justice, applied in serious crimes, murder, treason, major theft. But you'd probably never see a royal judge unless your case was big or political. For day-to-day life, it was manorial justice. Your lord, the very man who owned your land, was also your judge. Think about that. The person you worked for was the same person who could fine you, jail you, or order your punishment. Where's the fairness in that? If your fence collapsed into your neighbor's field, fine. If your pig wandered onto the Lord's road, fine. If your wife sold ale without a license, a larger fine. If you couldn't pay, more labor, more control, more humiliation. The court was usually held in the manor hall. No lawyers, no jury, just a list of complaints and punishments, read aloud while you stood shaking in the mud. Even small things could be punished severely: gossip, whipping, insulting your neighbor, a public apology on your knees, breaking curfew, fined or jailed, catching a fish in the Lord's river. You could be hanged, yes, hanged, for fishing, because that fish wasn't yours. It belonged to the Lord, just like the land, the tools, the water, even the air you breathed felt borrowed. And what about women? If you were poor and a woman, your position was even more fragile. Accused of witchcraft, you might be drowned, burned, or tortured. Speak out too loudly, you were hysterical. Caught alone with a man, you were immoral. Pregnant out of wedlock, you were publicly shamed. There were no protections, no rights, just whispers and judgment. If you were raped and poor, the courts rarely listened. But if you were accused of seducing a nobleman, you were the villain. That the scales of justice weren't just tilted, they were nailed down. And then there was public punishment, the theater of cruelty, because the law wasn't just about punishment. It was about example: the pillory, the gallows, the ducking stool, torture chambers in castles, executions in open fields. People gathered like it was a festival. Children sat on shoulders. Vendors sold pies. A hanging was a warning: stay in your place, obey, don't question. Even death was not yours to own. It was staged, judged, and displayed. But not everyone obeyed. Sometimes peasants resisted. They hid food. They skipped taxes. They whispered ideas at night. And sometimes they ran. They fled to forests, to cities, to monasteries, anywhere beyond the reach of the manor's grip. But even then, the law chased them. A runaway serf could be captured years later, dragged back in chains, and forced to work the land again as punishment for wanting to be free. Imagine that. Wanting to be free was illegal, yet still the fire burned, because every punishment, every injustice planted a seed, a question, a rebellion, a dream, that maybe, just maybe, this system wasn't forever. And sometimes the poor fought back. In a world where there was no medicine, no education, no escape, there was God. And for the poor, belief in God was not a choice, it was survival. Because when the crops failed, when your children died, when the Lord took your land and the plague took your friends, there had to be a reason. There had to be meaning. And so the church became everything. It was your calendar, your moral compass, your newspaper, your judge. It told you when to plant, when to fast, when to mourn, when to hope. Told you who you were, and more importantly, who you weren't. The church taught that life was suffering, but that suffering was wholly a test, a ladder to heaven. And if you were poor, that wasn't unfair. It was God's plan. You were taught that the meek would inherit the earth, that riches were dangerous, that humility was sacred. Your poverty wasn't a curse, it was a path to salvation, and so you obeyed. Not just your Lord, but your priest. Every Sunday you gathered in a cold stone chapel. Most couldn't understand a word. The sermons were in Latin, but you knelt, you listened, You crossed yourself. The priest stood in fine robes. He held the Bible, a book you couldn't read, printed in a language you didn't know. He spoke of hell, of eternal fire, of judgment, and you believed him, because everything else in your world was uncertain, but God was not. You gave 10% of your harvest, the tithe, to the church. Even if your own children went hungry, you couldn't read, but you memorized prayers. You feared sin. You feared temptation. You feared demons, devils, purgatory. You feared your own thoughts. And when bad things happened, the priest would remind you, you must have done something wrong. It wasn't the rats that caused the plague. It was your sin. It wasn't the Lord's greed that led to hunger. It was your lack of faith. It wasn't the system that failed. It was you. But here's the paradox. The church also gave comfort, because when your baby died, the priest held your hand. When your wife fell ill, he prayed over her. When you felt abandoned, he reminded you that heaven was real, and heaven was everything. Heaven was warmth, bread, clean water, laughter. It was the only place where you might finally be free. This is why the church was so powerful, because it didn't just control the body, it controlled the soul. Some priests were kind, compassionate. They gave what they could. They taught what they knew. They were poor themselves, closer to you than to the bishop. But the church as an institution, it was also political, strategic, rich. By the 12th century, the church owned more land than any king. Monasteries became landlords. Bishops became nobles. They collected taxes, enforced rules, built castles, and while you worked in rags, they dined in silver. The church had courts, ecclesiastical courts, separate from royal justice. If you were accused of blasphemy, adultery, or heresy, you could be tried by the church and heresy. That was dangerous, to question doctrine, to challenge authority, to suggest that maybe God didn't favor the rich. That could cost you your life. You could be excommunicated, cut off from the sacraments, shunned by your village, doomed to hell, or worse, you could be burned. Because for the church, heresy was not just wrong, it was contagious, and yet belief persisted. Despite the fear, despite the hypocrisy, people still believed. They lit candles, wore crosses, carved prayers into walls. They found meaning in symbols, in saints, relics, miracles. Women prayed to the Virgin Mary for healthy births. Farmers prayed to Saint Isidore for good harvests. Sick children were touched with holy water. Dying men whispered psalms, because, sometimes, faith was the only thing left, and belief had power. It united the poor, gave them identity, made them feel less alone. In a world without science, faith was how you explained the stars, the sickness, the seasons. It was how you made sense of death. And sometimes, it was how you resisted, because when the church became corrupt, people began to question. When priests grew rich while their flocks starved, when bishops built towers while children buried siblings, when indulgences were sold, promises of heaven for money, the whispers began, not loudly, not yet, but they would grow into sermons, into songs, into fire. You can only push people so far. You can starve them, silence them, punish them. You can chain them to the land and tell them it's God's will. But sooner or later, someone stands up, and when one person stands, others follow, because hunger can turn to fury. Obedience can curdle into rage. And in the Middle Ages, that rage sometimes boiled over. Let's go to England. The year is 1381. For decades, the country has been bled dry by war. The 100 Years' War with France has emptied coffers and filled graveyards. To pay for it, the king imposes new taxes, brutal ones. The poll tax. Every adult must pay, regardless of income. Even beggars, even children. The poor are done. And so, they rise. It starts small, a few villagers refusing to pay. But within weeks, the countryside erupts. Tens of thousands of peasants, laborers, and farmers march toward London, armed with pitchforks, axes, tools, led by a former soldier named Wat Tyler. Their demands are simple: end serfdom, lower taxes, equal justice, the right to work for wages. They don't ask for castles, they ask for freedom. Imagine it, you, a peasant, born in mud and misery, now walking with thousands, shoulder to shoulder. For once, you're not begging, you're demanding. When the rebels reach London, they storm the tower, they execute the king's treasurer, they burn legal records, they terrify the nobles, because the order of the world is shaking. For a moment, it seems like everything might change. But then, betrayal. The 14-year-old King Richard II rides out to meet the rebels. He promises reforms. He speaks of fairness. Wat Tyler meets him, calmly, in a field. But as they speak, the king's men stab Wat in the gut. He falls, bleeding. Betrayed, chaos erupts. The king lies, says he'll honor the promises. The rebels return home, and then, one by one, they're hunted down, executed, hanged, drawn and quartered, and the revolt ends in blood. But something changed that day, because now, the elite knew, the poor could rise, and the poor learned they weren't alone. The English peasants' revolt wasn't the only one. There were uprisings across Europe, France, Germany, Flanders, Italy. In France, the Jacquerie Rebellion of 1358 saw peasants torching noble estates. In Germany, revolts surged during the 16th century, calling for religious reform and economic justice. In Florence, even textile workers, the Ciompi, seized control for a brief, shining moment. These weren't random riots. They were explosions of desperation. Because when your children are dying, and the law is cruel, and the church calls your suffering holy, eventually the silence breaks. But here's the bitter truth. Most of these revolts failed, crushed by knights, smashed by armies. Leaders were tortured, supporters hanged, the elite returned to their halls, the priests resumed their sermons. The fields were planted again, with fewer workers and tighter chains. But each revolt left a crack in the system, and cracks, over time, become fault lines. Some lords, terrified, began to loosen their grip. Some serfs were granted freedom in exchange for loyalty. Some cities began to offer wages, contracts, protection. The world shifted, slowly, and though the system of feudalism limped on for centuries, it would never be the same again, because now the idea had taken root, that the poor had voices, that the land could belong to those who worked it, that suffering was not sacred, it was oppression. These rebellions weren't just political, they were human. They were cries from the dirt, from men and women who had nothing and risked even that for a taste of justice. Their stories are rarely told. They weren't kings. They didn't write books. They died with no statues, no scrolls, no names. But their fire still burns, because their courage didn't vanish. It passed down by generation, into the revolutions that followed, into the rights we hold today. We've traveled through centuries. We've stood in muddy huts, walked barefoot on frozen fields, buried children with empty stomachs, knelt in fear before lords, priests, and judges. We've watched the plague devour entire villages. We've seen hope flicker in rebellions and vanish in betrayal. But now, it's time to ask the most important question of all. Why does any of this still matter? Because history is not just what happened, it's what keeps happening. And when you look closely, you'll see that the lives of the medieval poor aren't so far from ours after all. Let's start with the system. The feudal pyramid may be gone, kings, lords, serfs, but the structure, it's still here. We still live in a world where a small number of people own everything, and a large number of people work every day, and still struggle to survive. Back then, peasants worked the land but didn't own it. Today, many people work 60-hour weeks and still can't afford rent. Back then, the poor were punished for stealing bread. Today, people go to jail for shoplifting food, while billionaires evade taxes without consequence. Back then, the church said your suffering was part of God's plan. Today, some systems still tell you your poverty is your fault. Sound familiar? Let's talk about health. In the Middle Ages, peasants died from preventable diseases because they had no access to medicine today. In parts of the world, people still die of diarrhea, of untreated infections, of hunger, not because the cures don't exist, but because they can't afford them. Is that so different? Let's talk about work. In the Middle Ages, peasants worked sun up to sundown, with no breaks, no rights, no protections. Today, factory workers, farmers, gig workers, migrants often work the same way. No safety net, no fair pay, no rest. The tools have changed. The contracts have digital signatures, but the pressure, the exhaustion, the injustice, still real. And what about dignity? What about being seen? The medieval poor were invisible in the history books, and today, so many of the people who clean our streets, grow our food, so our clothes are just as invisible. They are forgotten until something breaks, until a strike, a protest, a tragedy. Then the cameras come, then the sympathy. But it's temporary, because the system teaches us to look up at the kings, the celebrities, the rich, not down at the roots. And yet, the roots are where everything begins. So here's why this story matters, because it reminds us that the world was not built by kings, it was built by the poor, by mothers who raised families without food, by fathers who worked broken-backed in the fields, by children who never got to be children, by rebels who risked everything for freedom, even when they didn't live to see it. They built roads, planted crops, raised cities, lit revolutions. They left no signatures, but their fingerprints are everywhere, and many of their battles still aren't over. If you're watching this from comfort with food in the fridge, clean water in the tap, and safety around you, remember, you are the answer to their prayers. You are the person they dreamed of becoming. You are the first in your line, perhaps in 800 years, to be free. What will you do with that freedom? Will you scroll past poverty? Or will you see it? Will you look at injustice and say, that's just the way it is? Or will you question it, like what Tyler did? Will you ignore the echoes? Or will you listen? Because history is not just behind us, it is inside us. We carry their bones, their voices, their pain, their resilience. We carry their unfinished story, and we have a chance, maybe the only chance, to write the next chapter differently. So, if this story moved you, if you felt something, a chill, a knot in your throat, a memory of someone who still struggles. Don't keep it to yourself. Like the video, share it, comment with your thoughts. Tell us, where are you watching from? Have you seen injustice with your own eyes? Have you ever felt forgotten? Let's bring the invisible to light. Let's remember not just the kings and queens, but the people who bent the earth with their hands and still stood tall. Thank you for feeling. And wherever you are tonight, remember those who never got to tell their story. You just did it for them. Good night, and may their courage live in us.